Great. Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad to have this group. I know that it's people who've been in the community for differing amounts of time. And even if you've been here as short as a time as I have, you see things change, right? The world is constantly changing, and perhaps no more so than in the last year and change as we've dealt with this whole COVID crisis. And so that's what I want to talk about tonight, particularly the way that we have dealt with it from a spiritual perspective. You know, last week we talked about the ways that our technology has changed. And so this week we're going to talk a little bit more about how we've been touched by COVID and how we might think theologically about how to move forward from this experience. And so I'm going to share my screen, go ahead here and pull up our slides for the evening. All right, can people see my shared screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So tonight is Where Was God Keeping Faith in COVID Times? And this is part of my 3-part seminar series, Re-Emergence, the Church Beyond COVID. We have one more session coming up next week on Zoom, same time, Tuesday night, What Can't Be Unseen, Seeking Justice After the COVID Apocalypse. So we'll be thinking about the way that we do justice and serve the world a little more next week. But tonight, we're going to talk about some of the more personal ways maybe that COVID has impacted our lives. And I just want to give a couple content warnings. We're going to be talking about, I'm going to invite some reflections on people's experience of COVID. And that may bring up some, we may know some people who have died. We may know some people who have died. That may bring up some grief feelings for folks. And I just want to be able to name that and make space for that. And then briefly in a portion at the end, I'm going to bring up one theologian's experience of sexual violence and how that relates to some of the theological themes we're talking about. So just to give people a heads up on that stuff. So I'd like to start off with these 3 questions. You don't have to answer all of them, but any one of them is good. So I want to ask, how has COVID impacted your life? Do you know anyone who's contracted it or died of it even? What are you grieving during this time of pandemic as we're finally moving, at least in the US, out of the long, dark COVID winter and beginning to maybe see the light at the end of the tunnel? How has COVID impacted your life? And are you grieving anyone or anything during this time? Pam.
Well, I had a couple of people who contracted COVID and passed away. I have a cousin who died in Arizona, and she was a couple of years older than me. She'd been ill, but that was sad. And then a really good friend of mine that I worked with at the chancellor's office. I found out that she passed away last December, and she was just the neatest lady. And that just was very, very sad for me. Brought me to tears because she was such a wonderful woman. And, it's just been really hard for a lot of people, I think. And I think the hardest part is, people are in the hospital and you can't go see them. It's just been, by yourself. And that's just tragic. But how it's affected me, I'm at home all the time. I do walk my dog. I do play golf now. When golf was shut down at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought I was going to go nuts. And then they opened it up, and I'm telling you, that saved me because number one, I could go outside and get exercise. Number two, I saw some of my church friends and other friends twice a week. And so that opened up the ability to have that human interaction because you couldn't go to church except on Zoom, and everything was pretty shut down, for well over a year. And I'm sure everyone else has got stories like that too. But it's been unbelievable this last year and a half. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Pam. I think a lot of people, can identify, especially with that sense of just being kind of isolated, even if you don't know anybody who's been impacted directly by the virus. Absolutely. I saw Kimmel and then Tina who want to share a little bit.
Well, yeah, I'm going to brag about Pam for a minute. She has 2 holes in one behind her as a golfer. I don't think you knew that, Tom, but this is really remarkable stuff. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. It has been a rough year for me, and I guess everyone. I've had 4 people die in the last 9 months, but not of COVID. Heart disease, cancer, alcoholism, Parkinson's, all different ages. A physician who was 56, 2 kids, metastatic brain cancer, just on and on and on. So that has been a big hit, something that takes years for me to process. It has involved depression and anxiety and isolation. I'm blessed to have an incredible partner. We've been married for 7 years and together for 13, which has been a great support to me. But like Pam, the isolation is just stunning. It's unlike anything I ever imagined I would experience in this lifetime on a long-term basis. I mean, it's just everything was taken away from me. My volunteering at the elementary school, working for urban community outreach with the clients directly, interacting with some of you on church committees and boards in person, not being able to travel, to see family, all of that. It's just the only travel I did in the last year was to attend a celebration of life in Oregon for one of my friends who died. And that was a risk factor I had to weigh last October, but I decided to do it. And so it has been very difficult. It's involved some counseling, obviously, for me, and just getting through, being happy that, I'm still here and functioning and not sick, and fully vaccinated. So that's been kind of the journey I think that many, many millions of people can share and empathize with.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Kimmel. And yeah, I think that's true. I'm really sorry to hear about your friends. It's your point about the only travel you've done being for a memorial, I think really stood out to me from what you were talking about. There's something really sad in that. So thank you for sharing. I've got Tina and then Yvonne and then Dottie. And then we'll keep moving, even though I'm sure people have lots of things they could share. So Tina, go ahead.
So I'm so glad that you're doing this session on grief, because I have been really experiencing a lot of grief, and both kind of personally and collectively. And while no family or friends have died, there's been a lot of, experienced a lot of just worry for family members who did get COVID. Several of Jose's family members in Bolivia, and actually one of them did end up dying of it, an older cousin, more his age. And my sister got it, and my dad was exposed to her before she knew she had it, but he didn't get it. So it's just been added to the stress of the situation. And then because for us, all of our family involves an airplane flight or several to get to them, either in back east or in South America. Not seeing any family. So the saving grace has been the technology, the video chats, and the church community has been a huge saving grace. But just in terms of the whole, what the world has been going through and what this country has gone through as well, I feel overwhelming grief. And I think because of my particular, artistic temperament and all of that, that I am maybe a little bit more tapped in sometimes to some of the things that I'm feeling. And so I've been longing for really collective ritual grieving. I was so grateful for the grieving the ritual the night before the inauguration. I've been so grateful for what we have done in church. I've done some on my own of what I call basically crying therapy, of setting a timer and crying. I did some of that on Good Friday and kind of took advantage of that. And I just feel kind of stuck and blocked emotionally. And so I'm feeling the need to do more of that kind of proactive grieving, because I find it is cleansing, and it just helps to, kind of process it and wash it. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, it doesn't even have to be grief about COVID. It can just be about the overall state of the world, which COVID just seems to have made worse. So I absolutely, and as an artist, I think I share some of that. So thank you so much. Yvonne, and then Dottie.
My year it just totally turned upside down and inside out. It started out very positive, coming back from a wonderful trip to Hawaii and finding out that 2 nieces and a great nephew and a granddaughter all had COVID. And thank God they all survived, but it looks like my granddaughter is going to have problems for the rest of her life. She has never fully recovered from it. And then I lost my job. And because of the COVID lockdown, it was extremely difficult to try and get another one. And eventually financial problems started to come to rear their ugly heads. And so I lost my home. I left California and moved in with my brother. And for a hermit-like personality, such as myself, to move in with an avowed hermit has made life even more difficult. I'm basically living inside of 2 rooms, and I go days on end without speaking to anyone. If it weren't for Zoom, I would not have any outside contact right now. So it's been a hell of a year, and one I can really do without a repeat on. When you throw in the Black Lives Matter on top of it, and for a person who loves singing as much as I do, to lose my voice as just, it's like one more thing. And I know they say God doesn't give you more than you can handle, but I think God needs to do a reassessment of this particular individual.
I think some of the psalm writers would agree with you on that. That sounds like that's a really sucky year. I'm so sorry. I think I can speak on behalf of all of us, and that we're very glad for the technology that you can stay connected, and that we can stay connected with you.
Amen to that.
So, Dottie, and then we're gonna move into the education pieces.
I'll try to be quick. That's hard for me.
No worries.
I love isolation. I love spending time by myself, and I like being in charge of my schedule. I was blessed to work 6 months out of last year, 2 months at the beginning of the year before COVID, and then 3.5 months at the end of the year. So that took me out of my house, but my current job, and it's continuing. I've 8 months this week while I'll have been on a job, which is unheard of. I mean, it's like, wow. And kind of fell into my lap. And I work with nobody. Everybody in my department is remote but me. So I have access to people, but I don't have to answer to them. I don't have to pay attention to them and all of that. I have had numerous nieces and nephews and a sister-in-law, all who got COVID. And as far as I know, all have healed well and nothing residual, but one niece who's in Germany right now just got out of quarantine. She never actually got COVID. She was quarantined. I misspoke on that one, but the guy behind her in a class got COVID and the whole class was shut down. So she was heavily exposed. And she has 2 little boys that her husband had to take care of for 2 weeks. And, so it was a big inconvenience. But I think one of the hardest things for me in this time is that Ivy, my partner of 46 years, was in Florida, and I would have gone to see her had travel not been so prohibitive. She was declining with dementia fairly quickly, and I would have loved to have gone and seen her one time after she moved from here a couple of years ago. And that was really hard. I had to, do all my communicating through her daughter. And that was really probably the hardest part for me in this whole COVID thing. So, but I think I have been one of the more fortunate and blessed one in that I really do not mind spending time alone, a lot of time alone. So that's just a little bit of a, I don't know why I was blessed with that, but I was. So anyway, enough, and I look forward to the rest of the class.
Thanks, Dottie. As I'm listening to folks, I'm hearing just the variety of experiences we've had, and also the wide, the commonalities, right? As you're speaking, I feel like, Tina, your point about sort of grief rituals, this is the kind of thing, you could have COVID support groups, I feel like, for a while, for people to work out and to talk through everything that we've been going through, because it's been a lot just to survive it, let alone to process it. I don't know that we've had a chance to process it yet. So tonight, I want to give us an opportunity to think theologically about these issues that have come up, these questions of all the suffering in the world, all the injustice. But I also want us to keep in mind that we're talking about stuff that is, in fact, it's people's lived experience. We're not just talking about facts and figures. We're not just talking about theories and theologies. We're talking about the stuff of people's lives here. So as we move through, I want us to keep that in mind and in our hearts, those people and those places in our lives that have been affected by this pandemic. So I want to put a couple numbers to you, and this is as of earlier today, doing some Google searching and finding statistics. Right now, in the United States, we've had 32.8 million cases of COVID, confirmed cases. That's 1 in 10 people. That means that out of 10 people statistically speaking, 1 of them had COVID. And we've had 582,000 deaths, which is, my math, so I rounded up and down in a couple of places, so it might not be the best algebra, but around 1 in 600 people in the United States, which is a lot. That is an amazing number of people to die of a single disease in a single year. In LA County, it's been more than almost 4 million cases, and there have been more than 62,000 deaths. In the world, that's 159 million and 3.3 million deaths. You can sort of see how the US takes a disproportionate share of that. But it's also, we know that the pandemic is, thank God, we are moving into higher levels of vaccination in the US, but we know around the world, in places like India, which is where this photograph was taken, and in Brazil, and even in certain parts of the United States, particularly in low-income communities, particularly in communities of color, which have been hit hardest by COVID-19. It's still a going concern. We see a light at the end of the tunnel, but we're not out of it yet. And so if you're anything like me, you might find yourself sometimes asking the question, when you look around at the state of the world, at COVID, and also at all the violence and upheaval, how could our God let this happen? This is a question that it turns out people of faith have been asking for literally millennia, probably as long as we've had a sense of the divine. We've been asking about how can a good God allow evil? This is in theology speak called theodicy, or the problem of pain, which is the title of a book by the British author and fantasy writer C.S. Lewis. And so we're going to look at this question of theodicy, of how is God present in the midst of a pandemic? How can God be there when so many people are suffering and dying? And how do we think about that? How do we feel about that? What kind of theology can we use to even talk about such a thing? And I want to take us to look at ancient Israel, medieval Europe during the era of the Black Plague. Turns out COVID is not Christianity's first plague. And some contemporary US thinkers for answers, or maybe the better word would be questions. We'll use theology, we'll talk about a bit of philosophy, we'll talk about a bit of psychology. But again, I just want to remind us, this isn't the question of how could God allow this to happen. It's not an abstract. It's not just sort of a thought experiment. It's not a question in a book. It's a real question that people ask. And if you spend time with people who are in grief or who are survivors of disaster or violence, this is a very real question for a lot of people. And this is a real pastoral question. So I want us to approach tonight with the tenderness that deserves. And then, almost as if to undercut myself, a couple weeks ago, I asked on Facebook, what is the worst COVID response you've seen from a church? And I asked this on Twitter and my other social media platforms. You know, I was thinking about how has the church responded in the face of this big, huge, painful experience for so many people. And I got a variety of answers. Here are some favorites, probably isn't the right word, but one person said that what they didn't like, that some churches were saying don't give in to fear, by which they meant don't follow CDC guidelines for masking and social distancing. You may remember this from a year ago when the pandemic was new and houses of worship were really actively resisting, taking care of the people in the congregations. Folks like the televangelist Jim Baker, churches and pastors enriching themselves off of the pandemic with snake oil cures and that sort of thing. One friend related, somebody they know or a minister they know said, "COVID won't affect me because I'm protected by the blood of Jesus." Gathering in person before it was safe to do so. You can see on this semi truck, "Jesus is my vaccine." So folks who aren't getting the vaccines because they think that because they believe that it's unnecessary or is a government plot. And then you may remember Kenneth Copeland. He's another televangelist saying that he had blown. He was calling down the breath of God, calling down the wind of God to blow COVID away. And a particularly silly, at least to me, I don't want to step on anybody's theological toes, I guess I should say. But so there's been a variety of church responses, and not all of them have been particularly helpful, at least for the people who responded to my question. But my personal least favorite church or religious response has been the COVID-19 pandemic is God's judgment on sinful humanity. This is a kind of thinking that we often see in the middle of natural disasters. You may remember back in 2005 that some fundamentalist ministers blamed Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans on the gay agenda, on the US's embrace of homosexuality. You may have heard this in smaller ways when people talk about illness. Well, you must not have prayed hard enough, or what did you do to deserve the illness or the unfortunate things that have happened to you. We see it when we talk about sexual violence, that classic line, what was she wearing? What was she doing? Was she drunk? She was asking for it. Usually she, not always. And then the line about police brutality, right? That he was no angel. I mean, maybe the cops did wrong, but it's not like he was a perfect person. There's this sort of underlying theology that if something bad happens to you, it's all your fault. And I find myself wondering if COVID is a judgment, which I don't believe it is, but if it is on humanity, then what did all those people do wrong? Does the wrath of God predominate among certain groups of people based on income and race? Does it predominate in the US as opposed to in other places like New Zealand or Taiwan that contained the virus? This is what philosophers call an example of a just world hypothesis. And it's a way that humans, it's a way that we think, it's a cognitive bias that tells us that there's cosmic justice in the universe. And it works backward from, well, did something good happen to you? That must mean you deserve it. Did something bad happen to you? Well, that must mean you deserve it. You must have done something wrong. There must have been a glitch somewhere that led to you deserving to have this unfortune heaped upon you. And that's a message we hear from others. And it's also perhaps one, if you're anything like me, that you've told yourself a few times, that you take maybe a little bit too much credit for the good things that happen to you, and also give yourself a really hard time and blame yourself for the bad things that happen. Thinking theologically about this, Catherine Keller is a professor at Drew University. She's a theologian and a writer. And the book On the Mystery, Discerning Divinity in Process. Well, the cover there says Discerning God in Process. It's, I guess I mistyped that. Whoops. But it's one that I rely on fairly heavily in my conversation tonight, because she goes into a lot of these kinds of questions about how can God let bad things happen to good people. She's a process theologian. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But she says that a just world hypothesis comes down to a sense of divine omnipotence, God the Almighty. And it kind of raises the question, does this mean that God wills everything that happens to us? Is God actively responsible? Or does God have the power to intervene in our lives, but for some reason, good or bad, choose not to? And she traces this to John Calvin, who is one of the major reformers, along with Martin Luther and a couple of others. You may best know him for his doctrine of predestination, but I feel impelled, for the sake of historical honesty, to point out that he is one of the UCC's spiritual ancestors. The Reformed Church is one of the strands that comes together to influence Congregational churches today. So whether we like him or not, he's one of our ancestors. And Calvin believed that no matter what happens, God freely and unchangeably ordained whatever comes to pass. He was stuck with this problem of theodicy, of how can the world be the way it is and God still be on the throne. And here's a quote from him where he says, "It is certain that not a drop of rain falls without the express command of God. Therefore men, or women, or people," but he's wrote men, "can accomplish nothing except by God's secret command, that they cannot by deliberating accomplish anything except what he, God, has already decreed with himself and determines by his secret direction." And for Calvin, this is important because he believes that God is omnipotent, that God is all powerful, and that nothing can go against the will of God. And so this, his doctrine of predestination, preserves that omnipotence, but at the cost of human freedom and a God that would appear to love us, because I can't imagine a loving God willing the horrors of COVID on so many innocent people. This is something that's not just in Calvin. You can reject Calvin's doctrine of predestination, but this is a worldview that shows up actually in large parts of the Bible. So when fundamentalists and other Christians use this kind of line, it's not like it's coming from nowhere. It actually has places in the Bible where it offers opportunities to interpret misfortune like this. And I'm drawing here on the book Inspired by Rachel Held Evans. Maybe some of you know her. She was an ex-evangelical turned Episcopal blogger and author and kind of Christian, popular Christian feminist. And unfortunately, she passed away of a brain aneurysm a couple years ago. But she points out these places in the Bible where you get this kind of just world hypothesis, this kind of, so in Proverbs, you find the wicked man earns an empty wage, but those who sow righteousness reap true reward. She says it shows up in the stories of the kings of Israel, how Saul loses his crown because of his unfaithfulness to God, how David loses his son because of his seduction of Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite, and then Solomon loses his kingdom because of his unfaithfulness. Indeed, even the Babylonian exile, which is one of the most important events in the history of the Hebrew Bible, is some prophets understand it as God is punishing Israel for unfaithfulness, for worshiping idols, for turning away from Torah and the path of God. It's also in the New Testament, though. It's in the classic "you reap whatever you sow" here from Paul in his letter to the Galatians. And then you actually hear it, maybe not from Jesus, but certainly from his disciples. There's the story of the man who was born blind in the Gospel according to John. And when the disciples see him on the side of the road, they ask Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" You can see that assumption of if something bad happens to you, you must have done something to deserve it. Here throughout different parts of the Bible. So it's not coming from nowhere when churches say this. It's also not coming from nowhere historically. The Black Death is, as I mentioned, this isn't Christianity's first rodeo with plague, with pandemic. And even looking back at the bubonic plague, it actually in some ways makes COVID look tame, not to play down any of the horror that we've experienced over the last year and a half, but after arriving in Europe in 1347, the bubonic plague killed up to a half of Europe, and in some places far more than that. And it's actually where we get the word quarantine, because I don't know if you know anything about bubonic plague, but it's a disease spread by fleas on rats, and the rats would get onto the boats of sailors traveling around the world. And so it came from other parts of the world to Europe. And so they decided that boats traveling from Asia or from the Middle East had to quarantine, which literally means 40. They had to spend 40 days docked in the harbor and not coming to shore to make sure that they didn't have the plague, or that if they did, it ran its course aboard the ship. This, as you can imagine, losing half of the population of an entire continent had a huge impact on the way that people thought about God and thought about the church. It totally eroded people's faith in the Catholic Church and in the clergy. They were experiencing the daily horrors of people. You could get the bubonic plague and you could die within hours or days. It would come from nowhere, and they had no germ theory. They didn't understand why it was happening. It's not like now where we have epidemiologists who can explain to us how COVID transmits and tell us to wear masks and that sort of thing. It was a vast mystery to these folks, and so they responded with, the church couldn't explain it. The church couldn't seem to do anything about it. It hit rich and poor, men and women, English and French and Chinese and Turkish alike. It was absolutely ravaged the human community at that time. And this led to scapegoating, particularly against Jewish people in Europe at that time. Maybe you can see today where folks have used the anxiety, or have released the anxiety and the fear of these COVID times in scapegoating others. And it also gave rise, which is what I wanted to bring out, a movement called the Flagellates. And I've included a photograph from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, actually. You might remember the monks wandering through the streets of the village, hitting themselves in the head with wood. And it's a very kind of funny, silly idea in the film, but it was a real thing, actually. People didn't know where the plague came from. They didn't know why this was happening. And so they decided, or they believed, that this was God punishing them. This was God's wrath, but they didn't know what it was wrath for. So the Flagellates wandered through Europe, scourging themselves, engaging in ritual self-harm in an attempt to expiate and in order to work out whatever horrible sin had caused this catastrophe. And I include a line from a poem by an English writer, William Langland, here. And I think you could imagine people saying this in hospitals in Los Angeles or in New York City in the last year. God is deaf nowadays and will not hear us. And for our guilt, he grinds good men to dust. So you can see that there's this just world theology has a history in the church and in theology. And I want to ask you, as you listen to sort of this laying out of these people who sort of believe in this, I mean, what do you think? Does a just world theodicy work for you? Why or why not? What do you think of some of the ideas that people have raised here in the little information I've given us in the last 20 minutes or so? I see Roger, Dottie, and Kimmel. I'm not sure if people still had their hands up from earlier, but I'll start with Roger.
I hope my audio is on. I'm very insecure about my audio.
You're good, Roger.
But I've been reading a book called Society and Epidemics lately. It's pretty thick. It's by historian Frank Snowden. And he talks about everything you've been talking about, all the plagues. And in one section, he talks about the Ebola in West Africa. And he refers to a term called selfishness, in that by chopping down the rainforest and clearing for palm oil plantations, companies have displaced the bat population, which was the original carrier of the virus, the Ebola virus, and bringing it into close contact with the humans. And they've traced the whole outbreak to one little boy who was playing in a field, playing inside of a tree trunk, which was inhabited by lots and lots of bats, just shedding their viruses all over the place. Anyway, that's my thought on it. But he uses the word selfishness as the greed for money to keep chopping down the natural world in favor of palm oil plantations.
I did not know that. That's really fascinating. Thanks for sharing that, Roger. That actually sounds like a great book. Who's the author? Frank
Snowden. It's over there. I could bring it to show you the cover if you want.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and do that, and I'll.
It's right over there.
Sure, you go ahead and do that, and I'm gonna give Dottie, I think, was the person I saw with her hand up next.
Okay, let me make sure I'm unmuted. Okay. I went through a horrible grieving when I went off to college from Pentecostal fundamentalist background and learned that Adam may not be an Adam, 7 days may not be 7 days. And I was pretty flipped out for a couple of years. I'm not going to compete.
Sorry, that was maybe bad timing.
I don't know.
Thanks, Roger. We got it. I can see it. Thank you. Go ahead, Dottie.
After a lot of years, I left the church because I could not tolerate the mismatch between how I understood a loving God and what a lot of the people that I was surrounded with seemed to believe. I said, out of here. And part of out of my own theological immaturity, but I got rid of my pain by not being in that conflicting situation. Many, many years later, many, many things happened to bring me back. And I believe God is not omnipotent. I believe God does not create good or bad. I believe God is, by whatever name, higher power is what I usually use. It's, the universe is set spinning and here we are. And I believe that our reactions, our response, our behavior is really what drives things. If I believed that God interfered and allows some people to be destroyed by whatever reason, whether it's slums or bad neighborhoods or grocery deserts or whatever it is, and allows other people to flourish, i.e. Beverly Hills, etc., I would be gone so fast. So for my own mental survival in a religious context, my conclusion was that isn't real. And it brought me back to sanity like nothing I have ever experienced. I think how God functions is some power to soundboard off of, to listen to try to understand whatever guidance other people's understanding of that power is. So it's a bit of a roundabout way of convolution. I'm not a humanist, but I could probably be one. And anyway, I just totally reject all those kinds of notions about God did this, God did that. It doesn't work for me. I'm not saying I don't believe in God, but I don't believe that is God's role.
Yeah, thanks, Dottie. That makes perfect sense to me, and I think I really the sense of fleeing the church because you just couldn't buy into their sense of how God works in the world. I think that's huge. We have to have a God who we feel loves us and cares for us and that we belong to. And so I can totally hear where that would be a really important step to take towards sanity. So thank you. Kathleen.
To me, the issue of God's omnipotence boils down to human suffering. And how does God allow that? And you mentioned C.S. Lewis. Well, he said, God is ultimately triumphant, but right now we're in enemy territory. And that's a concept that allows for good and evil. A lot of people nowadays don't want evil. You know, they think it's a projection of your subconscious or, you know, an old-fashioned idea that the church is used to scare people. But I've seen evil and I know it's there. So that works for me. But I was surprised that you didn't use the example of Job for the Old Testament. Because, you know, he stuck with God. And yet there's a critique from Carl Jung that that was pretty selfish when he let his family and everyone else die, and or he didn't let them die, but he was part of the situation where they died. And so he took on an individual sense of soul that he was going to stick with God and be righteous and be redeemed, whereas usually in the Old Testament or Jewish communities, evil was collective. So he kind of set himself aside there. So if anyone is interested, Jung's book, Answer to Job, is pretty good. So.
Thanks, Kathleen. I find Carl Jung fascinating, and don't worry, we'll get to Job. Steve, and then
Yes, I won't speak long. Yeah, long time ago, I had to let my mind into to the theology side. Don't think theologically very often. I don't believe, haven't for a long time, of a divine personhood figure that can intervene and does intervene. That's way too heavy. As Dottie said, that works for her. But I think the opposite is true. It is, I think it's harmful to, can be very harmful to have that notion, not just individually, but collectively in a lot of ways, if you stop and think about it. I'm not exactly sure about. It's just what happens. The laws of nature, I think, is the way I feel. And something interesting that I really liked with our former pastor Jerry Stinson. His final year, he preached 10 series of 10 sermons about, people wanted to know. I think it was asked for it, of what he believes, and he was always very, very good. Say it several times over and over again. What his sermons and on his door, think for yourself. Your minister could be wrong, but he would always say, this is just where I'm coming from at this time. He said he's changed many times throughout his faith journey. But at the end, before he retired, he said, at this point, I believe that the term God he believes that as a metaphor for, how did he put it, our most enduring values, I think is how he put it. And I think about that a lot. I kind of like that. Anyway, that's all.
Thanks, Steve. And it does bring up, defining God or explaining why evil exists and how it exists. It may actually, I don't think it's something you can do it systematically. And I'm going to get to that here in a second. But I do think, these are the kinds of questions, because if we belong to churches that say the bad things that happen to us are as a result of our being queer, for instance, or a result of us being women, or the result of us having done something wrong to deserve the illness we have. I think, just speaking, not as a theologian, not as an educator, but as a pastor, that I see a lot of harm being done in that. And maybe you've had that experience, or you've watched somebody you love have that experience. So these are not, they seem theoretical, but these have real ramifications in people's lives and how they're treated in church. So in the spirit of Jerry Stinson, letting you know that this is where he's coming from at any given moment in his time, I want to share with you where I'm coming from. Here's my 2 cents. I don't care for the just world theodicy. I would argue that it amounts to a distant God who may be all powerful, but who doesn't really care about us. And what might be worse, actually, just cares about us instrumentally, allows bad things to happen to us for some greater good we don't understand and won't get to participate in. And I think this works backwards from suffering. Instead of meeting people where they are, it rushes too quickly to explain their suffering. I'd call it victim blaming, rather than being with people and meeting them in the midst of their pain and their suffering. It blames them for its existence. And whether they have any blame for it or not is it may be an open question, but I don't think it's particularly helpful to start from that place. Happily, there are other possibilities. There are other options for how to think about this. And I want to offer a couple of those for us in the the last third of our time together tonight. And maybe you'll find some of these helpful, or maybe you've thought about them before, but I'm going to take us through 3. We're going to do the book of Job. There you go. Way to anticipate my content. We'll look at, that's from ancient Israel, of course. We'll look at Julian of Norwich, who was writing actually in the midst of the Black Plague and its immediate aftermath. And then we'll go back to that idea I mentioned earlier of process theology and look at a couple American theologians who come from that perspective and what that might have to offer us. So to start with Job, just to give you a little bit of historical background, this is a book that was of the Bible that was written sometime between, our scholars believe, between the 7th and the 4th century before the Common Era. And it actually starts with the words, once in the land of Uz. And scholars suggest that, is Job a historical account, or is it kind of a once upon a time? Is it kind of a fable meant to explore an idea? Is it a short story? Is it an exploration of a theme by literary means? It's that is up to the interpreter, but I think it's really interesting to think of it as basically a grappling with this question of theodicy, of how does a good God allow bad things to happen. And so Job, in case you don't know, is a righteous man. He has a family and lands and flocks and possessions, and he's well respected and very pious, and does all of the religious devotions of his time and his place. And the book offers this framing device that God and Ha-Satan, which means in Hebrew the adversary, but which you might even think of, I mean, we talk about Satan, of course, but some scholars suggest that maybe it's more God's prosecuting attorney. Think the DA, right? This Satan is God's DA. He's working for the big man, and they make a wager that Job will remain faithful even if he has everything taken away from him. And so he does. He ends up with sores all over his skin, not unlike the bubonic plague. His entire family dies. His house gets blown away in a whirlwind, all in the space of a single day. Everything gets taken from him. Maybe there have been times in your life where you felt a little like Job, when it rains, it pours, and not in the good way. And Job wants God to answer for God's behavior. Job demands answers. He says, I am not answered. I call aloud, but there is no justice. And he sits in sackcloth and ashes and wails and demands God listen to his plea. And his friends come up. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, 3 friends come up who are practitioners of a kind of just world theodicy. They're the well-intentioned friends who sit down with you after the death of a loved one and say, well, everything happens for a reason. Or God never gives us more than we can bear. I'm not entirely convinced that God doesn't give us more than we can bear, but that's maybe another question. So here are some of the things they tell Job in the midst of his suffering and his pain. As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Submit to God and be at peace with him. In this way, prosperity will come to you. Blessed is the one whom God corrects. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, for he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. Maybe I am a particularly bitter kind of person, but if my friend said any of that to me when I was grieving the loss of my loved ones and my health and everything else that I had in the world, I might tell them to politely, I'll use a polite version, to go away. How's that? Which is, in fact, exactly what Job does. Miserable comforters, he says. Miserable comforters are you all. Have windy words no limit? Or what provokes you that you keep on talking? For Job, this just world's theodicy isn't good enough. Everything happens for a reason isn't good enough. He wants to talk to the man upstairs. He wants God to answer. And God shows up. God shows up in one of the most spectacular bits of poetry in the Hebrew Bible, in the form of a whirlwind. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? God asks Job. And he takes us on a whirlwind, pun intended, tour of creation, from the motions of the leaves on a tree or the fish in the ocean to the stars. The entire creation is laid out. God lays out, here is what I have done. It's kind of an oblique answer to Job's question, but as Maggie Jo Singer, who was the storyteller and the spiritual teacher at a synagogue I attended in Berkeley, says, this is a feral God. He's not a tame lion, in the words of C.S. Lewis. Or she, or they. I'm using he because those are the pronouns that the writers in question used. And Rachel Held Evans, in her book Inspired, closes us out in this way. In a rather satisfying final burn, God informs the 3 philosophers, Job's friends, that Job, the man they had condemned as a sinner, will have to intercede in prayer on their behalf. And I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. Ouch. So like I say, this is God coming and then giving a tour of the magnificence of creation. isn't really a response to Job's questions about suffering and why he's been made to suffer the way he's been made to suffer. But Catherine Keller writes, is it trying to tell us something about our losses, our finitudes, our creaturely vulnerability as woven into the inhuman fabric of creation itself? Is this the truth of the whirlwind, that God, the spirit of the whirlwind, does not will our suffering, but does will a world, a living, whirling, open system of a world? I'm reminded of what Steve and some other folks are talking about. What happens. I think it might have been Dottie who was talking about God doesn't will our suffering, but God does bring the world into being. And the world is a place where beautiful and terrible things happen. Maybe God's monologue about the wonder and magnificence of creation puts Job's situation in perspective. Sometimes the most important thing I can do when I'm really, really anxious or really stressed out is to go for a hike in the woods or climb up a mountain or look at the ocean, at least in part because it reminds me that as much as I may be suffering, and this doesn't have to be your practice, but it works for me sometimes, it's a reminder that my suffering is part of this huge, beautiful creation. And it doesn't make me insignificant, but it does at least remind me that, oh yeah, there's more to the universe than just what I'm experiencing right now. I can find that kind of cosmic perspective very helpful. I would say that Job's willingness to be honest about his pain, not to explain it away, not to let God off the hook, not to just engage in this kind of pat, everything happens for a reason, just world theodicy, is what leads him to deeper relationship with God. It's a paradox. It's not meant to be understood in a kind of argued out way. It's the kind of peace and knowing that passes understanding that we read about in the New Testament. So that's a series of possibilities for Job. You could teach an entire series on Job and never plumb the depths of that book, but I wanted to give us one set of possible answers that we get from our ancient Jewish forebears, spiritual forebears. Another possibility comes to us from Julian of Norwich, and I'm drawing here on a book by Matthew Fox that was actually just published last year. Julian of Norwich, Wisdom in a Time of Pandemic and Beyond. And some of you may know Matthew Fox. He's one of the godfathers of creation spirituality. He raised a lot of hackles in the Catholic Church in the 1980s by talking about how instead of talking about original sin, we might talk about original blessing instead, and was actually kicked out of his religious order. But he's still living in the Bay Area and writing. This is his most recent work about the medieval mystic Julian of Norwich, who was born in 1343, that is to say, just a few years before the Black Death came to Europe, and died sometime after 1417. We don't know exactly. She is the first named female author in the English language. And she lived not just through the bubonic plague, but also at the age of 30, she contracted a deadly illness that nearly sent her to her grave, and then lived for decades as an anchorite. And an anchorite is a kind of nun, a kind of religious person who lives in a solitary cell full time. She spent the last couple decades of her life living in a cell, not going outside, simply being there. And I'll get to a little bit of why she chose that life. But I like this image of her. She had a cat, which was practical as much as anything else. It was a way to keep the vermin away in this little cell she had in a church in Norwich in England. And I like the idea, if you spent any time hanging out in quarantine, Julia knew what it felt like, and she too received comfort from having a cat around. After her deathly illness, she experienced extremely powerful mystical visions. She called them showings of the love of God. You can see the name of one of her books in that image there, The Revelations of Divine Love. And God experienced as mother. Jesus Christ experienced as mother. God is this great, loving, caring, feminine figure. And in her writing, she doesn't rely on other theologians. She doesn't rely on the abstract principles of the Catholic theology of her day. She relies on her experience. She relies on what she has seen and what she's experienced of God and the suffering she's seen and the suffering she's experienced. And that is the primary text where she does her theological work. And through that, she arrives at something that Matthew Fox calls Panentheism. Maybe you've heard that word. It means pan, everything in Greek, en, in, and theism, God, belief in God. So Panentheism is the belief that God is in everything and everything is in God. And she believed that even in the midst of suffering and death, and rather than try to explain what that meant for her, I'm going to offer the opportunity for her to speak in her own words. I'm going to give these two quotes. This one is, and they're both two of the most famous things she's ever said. You may have heard these before. She's talking about her visions here, the visions, the powerful visions she experienced. And in this, God showed me a little thing, the quantity of a hazelnut, lying in the palm of my hand, as it seemed. And it was as round as any ball. I looked upon it with the eye of my understanding and thought, what may this be? And it was answered generally thus, it is all that is made. I marveled how it might last, for I thought it might suddenly have fallen to nothing for littleness. And I was answered in my understanding, it lasts and ever shall, for God loves it. And so have all things their beginning by the love of God. In this little thing, I saw three properties. The first is that God made it. The second, that God loves it. And the third, that God keeps it. And you can see in the image, Julian with the hazelnut in her hand that contains the cosmos. Maybe you've run into this idea in the writings of Sufi mystics like Rumi and Hafiz. Or maybe you've had those experiences yourself where the beauty of a single flower or a single tree or just seeing a bird out the window, the beauty of a small moment seems to open us to the presence and the love of God in ways that don't make any sense from a rational perspective. And then her second quote that I want to give us is probably her most famous. And she's grappling with exactly the question that we're grappling with in our talk tonight. So in my folly, she writes, before this time, I often wondered why, by the great foreseeing wisdom of God, the onset of sin was not prevented. For then I thought all should have been well. This impulse was much to be avoided, but nevertheless I mourned and I sorrowed because of it, without reason and discretion. But Jesus, who in this vision informed me of all that is needed by me, answered with these words and said, it was necessary that there should be sin, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. These words were said most tenderly, showing no manner of blame to me, nor to any who shall be saved. You can contrast that with the simple answer of, everything is for the greater good. Everything happens for a reason. You can see Julian here really encountering the reality of suffering and evil and hearing back from God. Yes, these things exist, and maybe it's necessary that they exist, but all shall be well, she writes. Remember, from a quarantined cell after great personal suffering in a Europe where half the population had died of the bubonic plague, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. It gives me goosebumps just to repeat it. I love that. And that leads pretty easily into the third perspective I want to offer, which is process theology. And we can boil down process theology. It kind of, and this goes back to something I think Dottie was saying about how God is not a person out there in process theology. It's not a being out there who's separate from us. Rather, God is in the very process of being human, of being alive, in the process of the evolution and unfolding of the universe. Again, you could probably teach an entire class on just this subject. But what I want to bring here is something from Catherine Keller's book that I mentioned earlier, that a panentheistic God is not one who wills or allows suffering. It's not God out there. but it's God who is with us in the suffering. You've probably heard that the word compassion comes from the Latin meaning to suffer with. It's a God who is with us in the hard times of being human. You might hear me say that whenever we do our participatory prayer that I've been leading as part of our online services. God is right there with us in the mess. That's one of the big insights of process theology. And it doesn't really explain why bad things happen, but it assures us that God is there no matter what. In the words of the Black womanist process theologian, Monica Coleman, God doesn't coerce, God calls. And if you tune in to worship this weekend, you'll hear me talk more about Monica Coleman, because she wrote the book that I'm going to be sort of building my sermon around. It's called Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith. And she's a professor of Americana Studies at the University of Delaware, and she's a process theologian. And the book details her experience with mental illness and sexual violence. And she both lives with bipolar 2 disorder and also is a survivor of a rape she had during college. And she talks about how she needed to get past that idea of blaming herself, telling herself that it was something she had done that meant that she was experiencing depression, something wrong she had done that meant that she'd been sexually assaulted. And she writes, process thought talks about a God who is radically present. God hopes for justice and beauty and adventure in the world. God calls each of us to do our parts to help make this happen. And sometimes people say no to that call. That often creates evil and suffering in the world, going back to Kathleen's point. But my assault was not willed by God, let alone a devil. The person who assaulted me did not heed God's call. But God is with us. In our broken, hurting, weeping ways, God is there. God weeps with us. She started something called the Dina Project, named after a woman who's raped in the book of Genesis, one of Jacob's daughters, as a project originating in Nashville, but that has had wider reach. That's really about allowing people who have experienced sexual violence, particularly women, a safe space to come and to know that God still loves them, that God did not want what happened to them to happen to them, that they are seen by other people, invite people to tell their stories and to be loved and heard in the midst of those stories, however painful they may be. And it's a really powerful ministry that she was called to, and through her own experience of suffering. And it speaks to me, to the idea of, Emanuel. I really love having that last name. Yes, it is my real last name. And I love it because it means God with us. And process theology, Panentheism, these ideas that Julian and Monica Coleman and Catherine Keller are talking about, is God who is with us, in us, and as us. It's a kind of radical incarnation. God is not just, God is participating in our humanity, is actively present in it. So that when we laugh, God laughs. When we weep, God weeps. And when we grieve, as we have been doing and will be doing over COVID for the last year and a half and into the future, God grieves with us. And it reminds me of a story. A friend of mine, the Reverend Jim Matulski, who is a UCC minister in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he's up there now, but he was active in the AIDS chaplaincy during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And he did a worship service during that time when he held up the bread and said, this is the bread, this is the body of Christ. When we eat this bread, we become the body of Christ. We are the body of Christ. The body of Christ has AIDS. There's something really powerful about being able to see how God is present in our experience, in our sickness, in our suffering, in our lives, because if we can see God there, then maybe we can begin to see God in the joy too, and the relationship and the laughter and the good. And so I might say, by way of closing out this section, that process theology's central insight is that we are the body of Christ. The body of Christ knows exactly what it's like to have COVID, and that God is not separate from that, but is in it with us. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I would like us to, I'd invite you, so now that you've heard some answers to that just world theodicy, what do you think? Have you experienced God with us during this pandemic time? And, I asked that question earlier. What's the worst church COVID response you've seen? What's the best one you've seen, maybe? We don't have time to answer all these questions in full, and maybe you don't have an answer to some of them. Maybe you need time to mull things over, but I'd like to invite you, if you want to respond to one of those questions, let's take a little bit of time here at the close of our time for people to talk about what's come up for them and what they think about some of the ideas we brought up.
Can you put them up again briefly?
Sure. Yeah, maybe went a little bit too quick there. Sure thing.
Thanks.
Yeah. So the questions were, what do you think? What do you think of these, of Job, of Julian, of process theology, as you've heard a little bit about them? Have you experienced the God who is with us anywhere during this pandemic? Or what's the best church COVID response you've seen? Where have you heard good theology? Where have you seen a good church response, a good religious response to the crisis we've been having? If anybody would like to speak, I would invite them to jump on in so we can leave this up for those who want time to consider it.
I think it's just been a case of churches figuring out ways to do even more in their communities, helping people and helping people to help one another. Also, this jump into technology to try and keep people far-flung, even though they're far-flung, to keep them involved in community. There was not as great an involvement in technology, I believe, for many churches, other than the mega churches, who, my own personal viewpoint, seem to be more interested in people's money than the people themselves. But now even the smaller churches, those that are barely, making do, have, through using their college students and such, enabled the church to keep going amongst their members, even though they could not meet together.
Thanks. I think, one of the ways, at least for me, one of the ways that God shows up in our midst with us, God with us, is through us, is when we take that opportunity to connect to people and make sure that people remain in relationship and don't feel isolated during this time. That's so important. Thank you. Other thoughts or reflections on any of those questions or anything you've heard tonight? Steve.
Not so much a reflection on that, but I know a most marvelous poet that kind of touched me recently when she wrote, maybe I have it the wrong order, but God with us, God between us, and God among us. That goes to my heart. I loved it. You might know who I'm talking about.
I think we all might, actually. I think she might have her hand up.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so honored. I'm so honored to be part of this community. Which, a little aside, has just been a huge part of my healing and my finding my path as a creative person. In response to this, I'm just delighted I've been aware of Julian of Norwich somewhat, and my sister, who's a retired Episcopal priest, really likes her. But I never heard the term Panentheism before, so I'm grateful for that, because it really describes what I experience, which is and the words are, God is within us, between us, among us, is in the poem, which is, and so I feel like I've found a new friend, and that's very cool. And then just the words, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. I'm going to be using that as a mantra. I find that just really wonderful. And I've been told by clergy in the past that they see a lot of process theology in my work. And I think it's because I feel that, what I experience is that we are in the unfoldment of the divine loving energy of the universe, creating in us and through us. And to the extent that we are able to open ourselves up to that, and some people do and some people don't. And so I agree with the example from Monica Coleman talking about that.
That's great. Thanks, Tina. And thank you for your poetry. I think one of the things about these schools of theology is their attempts to explain what people experience, right? And that wisdom comes from a lot of different sources. And then if you look at, there's that old line about theologians may argue, but mystics all speak the same language. And so if mysticism for me is just how we experience God in our lives, it doesn't have to be crazy visions. It can just be the simple things of finding God at table or in relationships, or maybe even on Zoom occasionally. So thank you all. Are there any other thoughts or reflections before I close us out tonight? Roger, and then Pam.
An old saying just occurred to me. It goes like, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, maybe the pandemic has pushed the church into the Zoom age, which will potentially give it greater reach than it ever has before around the world, theoretically.
It'd be so. Yeah, Pam.
Keep hitting the wrong buttons. Yeah, I'm really enjoying all of this, the different sources that you're using, and I'm kind of, radical. I don't consider myself radical, but yet when I see the terminology and how it's used, I am radical, in that sense. And God speaks to me. I think God is, through the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I just think that man has free will, and I don't look upon God as picking winners and losers. And I just think God is always with us and is walking the journey with us. That's how I want to view it, and that's what I believe. And I'm so enjoying this, Reverend Tom.
Well, thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's remember, radical just comes from the old Latin word rooted. You don't have to be a political radical like me to be a radical, in that good rooted sense. So, Randy, did you have something you wanted to share?
Well, just a question that occurred to me while you're talking about God and people asking him or her or they to intercede on their behalf. Is the night before a battle, German prays for the God to help him, since he's been God-fearing kill the Americans in his foxhole or whatever, praying to God to help him kill a German the next day, and then they're both killed. Who goes to heaven? Is there a heaven? Which one had the right God? Or they both have the right God within them, through them, and they just should not have been fighting, or whatever. It happened. Or que sera, sera, as Donna Shore says, as the great singer said.
Whatever will be, will be. You just raised a lot of theological issues there, my friend, and I do not think we have time to cover them all tonight.
It was Doris Day.
Oh, was that Doris Day? Yeah. Well, very nice. I like that. She's great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing about your experiences of COVID, for listening and for thinking with me and for encountering some of these ideas. These are, in addition to being fun to talk about these things briefly, it also gives me ideas for, things we might explore in more depth in later classes and things we can talk about in sermons. And, so this is great stuff. I really appreciate all of you for being here. And if you need to jump off, I completely understand. I've got 2 more quick things that should take about 5 minutes all told. But I want to be respectful of people's time. So feel free if you need to jump off. So the last thing I guess I'll share. Yeah, Kimmel left here. You know what? Actually, I think we came to a good place. I can leave those. I'll send out one of them in the message tomorrow in the Pilgrim. Actually, it's a song based on Julian's "All shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well." And I'd like you to have the opportunity to hear it and really listen to it, and not feel rushed. So, in that spirit, then go in peace, friends. This has been great. The recording, unless anybody has objections, will be posted. I'll send that out as well for folks if they want to check in with that. I'll send a download link to my PDF, or not to my PDF, to my PowerPoint, which will have all my sources and things on the works cited page. And God bless you.
Is that song "All Should Be Well" by Doris Day too? No, actually, it's by Meg Barnhouse. She's a UU minister. I know, a UU singing about Jesus. Madness. But hey, thank you all so much. Go in peace, friends, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Peace.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Well, good night.
Auntie.
All right.